Excuse me, sir, did anybody ever tell you not to eat directly out of the container? Can you get a plate? No? Welcome back, Endurance Nerds. I'm here again, live and in stereo, just spamming the shit out of your YouTube feeds with more Zwift Academy Road content, but you guys keep watching, I'm going to keep putting them up. But this video is coming a little bit out of sequence with the rest of the workouts because I've had several requests about the Pro-Contender workouts. Some of you are actually throwing your hat in the ring for the Pro-Contender contest, and some of you are just curious about these as additional workouts to take on as you go through the Academy. So I wanted to answer some general questions about these workouts, what they're intended to do, and whether or not they're right for many of you who might not be pursuing the Pro contract. For those of you who are pursuing the Pro contract, these two rides as well as the baseline ride are required for completion by Sunday, September 25th, 2022, after which you will still need to complete the Academy, but that initial deadline is going to be that kind of cutoff point for the participants in the Pro Contender program. Now, I'm not going to be performing these workouts for the purpose of this video for two reasons. One, I don't want to throw off the cadence of the proper workouts 1 through 6 for completion of the Academy, and two, because I'm going to get right to the point here, these are not actually workouts. What? Okay, I want to be really clear on that, especially for those of you who are not pursuing the Pro contract. Now, we use the term workout loosely to talk about performances at high intensity and working hard. You can go out on the road and do a workout. But when I use the term workout, I mean something that is structured with the intention of improving a particular energy system, building fitness, increasing capacity. These sessions are not that. Now, don't confuse that with me saying that there's no fitness benefit to doing them. There absolutely is. That stimulus and response is going to come from performing these sessions. However, there is a more efficient and more functional way to attack those types of improvements. These are assessments, plain and simple. You're going to use these for one of two things. One, for the Pro contest, or two, because as a rider, you want to glean more information about your power zones. You're going to deep dive this data and get a better understanding of yourself as an athlete going forward. I see people using the term bonus workouts in some of the comments. I'm not trying to throw shade. I just want people to understand these are not bonus workouts. These are not specially designed workouts just for people who are more talented or capable of being pros. They are assessments to separate the wheat from the chaff so they can eliminate probably about 95% of the participants of this program right out of the gate so they can focus on the critical few that are going to move forward to the semifinals and beyond. So if you're looking for more of a challenge as somebody who's just participating in the Academy, there are better workouts to target those higher executions of power, whether you repeat the workouts in the Academy itself, explore some of the prior year's Academy workouts, check out some of the other workouts in the folder, or even beyond the Academy if you're looking to take on more structured training, there are probably better outlets out there. If you are beginner to intermediate, there are some decent plans available on Zwift that can introduce you to periodized training and structure. If you're intermediate and beyond, you may want to look outside of Zwift. Zwift does okay, but they don't specialize in structured training. They're really focusing more on the community and the social elements of riding with some add-ons that help with structure and fitness, but there are definitely better designed plans and workouts out there. You can purchase plans from Training Peaks that will actually give you the workout files that you can sync right with Zwift and do them right within the platform. A lot of coaches will actually offer up kind of a free text format of a core training plan that you can use, and you can manually add in custom workouts to Zwift and do them and follow along with that type of structure. And I think the best bang for your buck, if you're willing to pay for an additional subscription, is Trainer Road. Trainer Road is about as close as you can get to having a one-on-one coach without paying for a coach. They have very flexible plans with very well-designed workouts that adjust to you with their newer adaptive training, which utilizes machine learning and AI to help to scale those workouts to you where it's appropriate throughout your micro, meso, and macro cycles. But I don't want to get too far into that. I'm just giving you actionable ways that you can continue beyond the Academy if you're looking to take structured training more seriously. Now, if you're still with me on this and you want to go into these assessments, you know what you're going to use them for, let's talk about what's going to go on here. I want to talk about two concepts before I get into these assessments because it's important to understand them if you want to understand what they're looking for in these assessments. The first thing I want to talk about is lactate threshold. Now, we often talk about lactate threshold being your FTP. We use that term very loosely, but in truth, there are two lactate thresholds, your LT1 and your LT2. LT2 is the one that you are all familiar with when we talk about FTP, your second lactate threshold, the break point at which the body is capable of clearing lactate at or slightly above the rate at which it is being produced. Anything above that lactate threshold 2 is going to be producing lactate in excess of the body's capability and eventually building up hydrogen ions and acidity into the system, that lactic acid breakdown, the premature fatigue. That is your LT2. However, LT1 is something we talk about much less. That is the break point at which your body starts to increase its lactate production above and beyond resting levels. This typically requires being tested, often in a lab, but you can also use at-home testers to get that value, and it's going to vary by athlete. A lot of the training literature talks about training within a 3-zone model. Your zone 1 is your fat burning zone and includes outputs up to that first lactate threshold. So you're basically able to produce at that rate without increasing lactate in the system. Your zone 2 is anything between your LT1, your lactate threshold 1, and your LT2, where you are producing lactate, but you are still within your body's capability of clearing it at or above the body's production. Zone 3 includes outputs above that LT2. So basically you are superseding your body's ability to clear that lactate, you're building up hydrogen ions in the system, and the muscles are starting to become acidic. Now, why do you see in programs like Zwift and other such programs that you see 5 or even 7 zone models? Well, from a training perspective and gleaning different benefits from your training, the 3 zones are a little bit too broad and they're not particularly specific. So by breaking down those zones into smaller, more bite-sized, if you will, sections, you can get more specific muscular benefits by working in the different zones. So you will see zone 1 recovery, zone 2 endurance zone, zone 3 tempo, zone 3 plus being your sweet spot, zone 4 threshold, zone 5 being your VO2 max. And then sometimes you'll see zone 6 for anaerobic and zone 7 for neuromuscular. And sometimes you'll see them kind of take all 3 of those zones, 5, 6, and 7, and call them all zone 5. Irrespective, it's just a way to break down the training zones into more manageable portions for structured training programs like this. Generally speaking, you will see zones 1 and 2 in this kind of 5-zone model fall into the zone 1 format of the 3-zone model. Zones 3 and 4 will be encapsulated in zone 2. And then zones 5 plus will be encapsulated in zone 3. The break points aren't perfect between those zones. Don't use that as rule of law. Remember, lactate is what's driving the 3-zone model, so you really need to test those break points. But from the standpoint of population averages, you'll generally see the zones shake out as I mentioned. The second thing I want you to understand before we talk about the sessions here is the concept of glycolysis. I'm not going to get into the weeds from a biochemical perspective here, but it is an important process to understand. It's our energy transformation mechanism within the body. And I'm being specific in my use of the term energy transformation versus energy production because we know from the first law of thermodynamics that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So we often use that colloquialism production, but just to be clear, we're not creating energy here. We're transforming energy from one form to another. So what glycolysis is transforming glucose into usable energy within the body. So we take glucose in a very oversimplified form, it's a lot more complicated that I'm going to mention here. We're turning that into pyruvate, ATP, and the byproduct of hydrogen ions. Now what's happening with those byproducts is that pyruvate binds with the hydrogen ions and it gets oxidized with oxygen being delivered from the blood, and that creates lactate. Now lactate is not the enemy. People often think lactate is a huge problem, we don't want to produce lactate. Lactate is critical, it's important, in fact it's a good thing, but people confuse lactate with the term lactic acid and assume that that's the culprit of that breakdown of muscles. Lactate is not the problem. The problem comes when you are working above your lactate threshold, that oxidation, that oxygen delivery to the muscles is not occurring fast enough to move that lactate and basically recycle it back through the Cori cycle, the important biological functions with these energy cycles. You're going to have these leftover byproducts over here. You're going to have these hydrogen ions built up. And when you build up too many hydrogen ions, the muscles then become acidic. That's what's causing the premature fatigue and the breakdown. Not the lactate, but the hydrogen ions. So your output level within your different zones is going to heavily impact how that energy cycle is working, whether or not you're going to have this excess byproduct in the system that you have to deal with. So with that out of the way, hopefully that precursor will help you to better understand what I'm going to talk about in these 2 sessions here. So the first session here, pretty straightforward. It's called aerobic capacity. It's testing exactly what it's telling you it's testing for. Your capacity within your aerobic power zones. What are your aerobic power zones? It's any of your power zones up to and including your VO2 max. Now, where does VO2 max fit into the cycle we just talked about? VO2 max fits in right at that rate of execution where you're still delivering oxygen to the muscles and you're moving some of that lactate back through the energy cycles, but you still are starting to build up those hydrogen ions. And you can do that for a certain period of time before you reach that break point where the body says, no more, I'm shutting down, I'm too acidic, you need to start clearing some of those byproducts out of the way before I execute yet again. So you're still using oxygen as a primary form of fuel for the muscles, but it is not adequate to maintain that power indefinitely. With that in mind, this assessment is going to test your VO2 max as well as your threshold level power. Now, how long can you hold your VO2 max for? Generally speaking, it's between 3 and 5 minutes. That is your maximum VO2 max level output before you start to build up that acidity to the point where the muscles are going to fatigue and no longer be able to sustain that power. Some individuals with the genetic capability or the extensive training to do that, those real high-end animals out there, might be able to hold their VO2 max longer, sometimes 6, 7, even 8 minutes. It's rare, but it does happen. But from the typical athlete perspective, expect between that 3 and 5 minute mark. You're going to see a free ride section within this workout here that's going to strike right down the middle. It's going to test you for about 4 minutes. But let's talk through the workout here. Now, I'm not going to talk through every single zone with specificity and percentages. I don't think it's going to be a great value for your time. I'm going to zoom in where it's necessary, but I'm going to talk about the workouts a little bit more broadly so that you understand. Again, these are assessments, so it's not super important to get into the minutia of every single interval. You're going to start with a basic warm-up here and then move into some priming sets. You're going to see that you're going to have some roughly threshold efforts with some VO2 max jumps just to start producing some lactate into the system, get the body ready and primed to do the work ahead. You're going to do a little bit of sustained effort here at your zone 2. It's going to be a more accurate representation of a race environment. This is what they're really trying to test for, to see how you would perform with a race-like execution. You're not going to really be able to sit in that full recovery noodle zone in a real race. You may, however, be sitting in your zone 2 in something like a draft. So you've got some tension in the legs, you're doing some work, but you're not necessarily burning any matches. Then you're going to move into a 4-minute segment here, which is a free ride. And that's where you want to give your maximum level of effort. Now, from a population average perspective, VO2 max is defined as above 105% of your FTP and usually truncates somewhere around 120% of your FTP. Again, depends on your training and your genetics. You might be a little bit below that 120%, you might be a little bit above, but 120% seems to be where most riders reside, even at the higher levels. Again, there's some specialists out there that can go north of that 120%, but it's a good number to keep in your head when you're doing the evaluation. And you need to be able to hold that for 4 minutes. Specifically to the Pro-Contender testing, they're going to be looking to see if you start to really fizzle out. A lot of people will go into these sessions and go really hard and then see power precipitously decline over the course of the 4 minutes. They're looking for something that's a little bit more stable. If anything, go in a little bit conservative and continue to build in towards that effort. If you're confident that you can hold 110% of your FTP for that period of time, maybe you start at 110%, and if you're feeling like that's sustainable, you continue to build in closer and closer to a higher execution of power. Professional coaches are going to read that as a sign of somebody who's experienced, that understands power execution, versus somebody who just goes all out and then just completely falls apart. They're not just going to look at a strict average. They're going to look at the entirety of the 4 minutes and how you performed. So just bear that in mind when you do that segment. Then you're going to get a roughly 10-minute recovery interval there and move into 10 minutes at your upper sweet spot, lower threshold zone, right around that 90%. At this point, they're trying to fatigue you before you're going to do basically an FTP test. So you're going to be building up lactate in the system, not above your body's ability to clear it, but it's asking you to deal with the extra byproducts that you've just built up during that 4-minute set, and then also deal with the lactate being produced during the 10-minute effort at a high percentage of your FTP. You're going to get a very brief recovery here, and then you're going to do 12 minutes, and this is going to be pretty much an FTP test. Now, this is going to look a little non-traditional for some of you, whether you're used to doing the ramp test or you're doing the 20-minute test. It doesn't mean that those are the only 2 mechanisms to test your FTP. This is attacking your FTP a little bit differently. You're using the first roughly 2/3 of the workout to pre-fatigue the system, build up that lactate and those byproducts into the system, and then you're going to be looking for a maximal execution for 12 minutes. That's going to be roughly at your FTP, within 5% to be sure. So when you're looking to Pace that effort. Again, they're going to be looking for some kind of even execution, well-paced effort, and not just continuing to fall off a cliff over the 12 minutes. You're going to want to target somewhere around what your known FTP is. If you're finding 4 or 5 minutes in that you think that this is sustainable and that you can continue through the remainder of the effort, that's when you start to add in your power. Maybe you move closer to 105% or even more if you're on a breakthrough day. Again, coaches are going to look at that and evaluate that as a sign of a mature athlete capable of becoming a pro. It's also a best practice for testing in general. Your FTP is not about the strict average of numerical values. It's about your ability to sustain and pace those type of efforts consistently. So you're going to get a good amount of information from this session here, whether you're going for the pro contract or not. You're going to get your VO2 max capability and you're going to get your FTP value pretty reliably by doing this. That being said, this type of assessment or workout is going to take a lot out of the system. Expect to not necessarily be capable of doing your hardest workout the next day. Probably plan for a day of recovery, if not full rest, after doing this assessment. Because if you're doing it right and you're going full gas for the requisite time periods, you're going to really exhaust yourself. Now let's talk about the second assessment here. This one's called Glycolytic Capacity. Now that I've prefaced this video with the definition of glycolysis, this might make a little bit more sense. We talked about VO2 max being that range of power execution where you're delivering some oxygen, but not quite enough. When we're talking about glycolytic capacity, in this case, we're looking at your anaerobic capacity. We're looking at that point you're no longer delivering oxygen as a form of fuel for the muscles. You are now operating, just building up those byproducts in the system, and they're not going anywhere. That's why you can only hold those executions of power for a very short period of time before you become too acidic to continue. Generally speaking, those executions are limited between 30 to 90 seconds and up to 2 minutes. So you don't have a ton of time to hang out there. You're just building up the burn. Theoretically, you could hold your breath and do these workouts because oxygen is not being utilized. I wouldn't recommend it. It's not really good for you. But from a very theoretical standpoint, oxygen is no longer being utilized. That is why you're limited to such short periods of time. This assessment here is trying to get you those upper and lower boundaries of that zone, right? What you can hold for 30 seconds is going to be vastly different than what you can hold for upwards of 2 minutes. 30 seconds is going to be slightly below your sprint level power, a little bit more sustained than that 10 to 20 second sprint, but still pretty high. Versus 2 minutes, it's going to be quite a bit lower. Unfortunately, as we get to VO2 max level power and above, those zone breakdowns by percentages becomes extremely unreliable. I talked about this in my Workouts 101 video in more detail. There are some population averages, but they really start to break down precipitously, and this is very much contingent on your genetic capability as well as your experience and training. So being able to test those boundaries high and low, you might get a better appraisal as to where your appropriate zones are. You might be the anaerobic animal that can work at a really high percentage of your FTP for those 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Some of you may not have that high level of force production. Just depends on your phenotype and your ability. So this type of testing protocol will help the coaches to get an evaluation of where you might land on that spectrum. So for this session, again, you're going to do that standard warm-up, that ascending warm-up. You're going to have a couple priming sets with some short, punchy efforts from VO2 max up to your anaerobic level power. And then you're going to get some recovery here before you do 3 different tests. They're going to have you evaluate the kind of bookends of your anaerobic ability and something right down the middle. And you're going to do these in order. So you're going to start here with a 30-second effort at your max anaerobic capacity, just under your sprint. What can you hold for 30 seconds? Ideally, like the last assessment, try to build into your peak power instead of starting at your peak all-out sprint and then just completely falling apart and lumbering all over the bike to maintain whatever watts that you have left in the system. It looks better to be able to build in and peak at your highest level of power. That's what long sprinters do, right? They don't just go really fast and then slow down. They're continuing to build speed and power all the way through the line and all the way through that bike throw. Then you're going to get a decent break at 7 minutes before you do a 1-minute test. So now this is going to be a lower execution that you just did in the 30 seconds. How much lower? Don't know. But don't try to reach that same level of power and hold on. In theory, you should not be able to do that. So you want to bring that down. Might be 10%, might be 15%. I don't know what that answer is going to be for you. You might know based on your experience, but give it everything you have for that minute. Again, same concept applies. Try to build yourself up into your maximum power versus starting with your max and falling off and just trying to hang on. You're going to get another 7-minute break here, and then you're going to have that 2-minute open effort. And I like to analogize this to your lead out man or woman in the pro peloton, right? You're the person at the end of the line that's taking and delivering your sprinter to the finish line. You are completely emptying the tank over the course of 2 minutes. You're a kilometer out, and you're going for that finish line, and you need to get the hell out of the way, you completely pull out of the way and your sprinter goes for the finish. That's about what that 2 minutes of effort is going to approximate. I'm gonna repeat myself, try not to go for that highest execution of power and trail off. Do more to be conservative, so to speak, and build into it. 2 minutes is a long time to be working anaerobically. This is going to be right at the upper limit of your VO2 max. So 120% might be a good benchmark to start. And if you can build from 120% of your FTP on upwards, that's probably going to be a pretty decent appraisal of where your lower limit of your anaerobic capacity lies. Then for the purpose of this evaluation, you're going to get a real brief rest, and you're going to see you have 2 segments here that are about 10 minutes each. Both of them are at your sweet spot. Now these ones are specifically for the Pro-Contender format. The coaches are looking to evaluate whether or not you can go to the well, burn those matches, and then still come back and execute at a reasonable level of power. They want to make sure that the Pro-Contenders aren't just blowing their load, so to speak, in the first half of the workout, but then are complete dog shit and can't continue to put out power. It's an important ability for your Pro-Contender to have. From an amateur or everyday rider perspective, maybe not quite as much value. I'm not saying that you can't learn anything from the back half of this test, and if you're a racer, might be good practice to be able to see how you can manage. But if you're just looking to evaluate your zones, there's probably better ways to do that, whether you just kind of lop off the back half of this workout, or there's other ways to evaluate your anaerobic abilities. A lot of times it happens just in your anaerobic workouts, right? You continue to kind of drive those power values up and up and up. Anaerobic workouts is a great way to use the FTP bias in the system. Because we can't very accurately evaluate the population averages for anaerobic efforts, that's where you need to hit that button up or down by upwards of 25% to get the proper stimulus that is right-sized for you. So as you get more experience with doing anaerobic workouts, you're going to get a better evaluation where the bounds of that zone are for you in particular. But if you really are looking just to do an open test, you can either do that on your own in a workout, or you can just use the front half of something like that. Just do a couple of priming sets and then do some fixed time frame tests. You can get a pretty decent evaluation of what your pure anaerobic capacity is. So that's it for the Pro-Contender workouts. The most important takeaway is that they're not actually workouts. They're assessments. If you're not going for the Pro-Contender workout and you're willing to deep dive into your data graphs there, whether you're going to jump into Strava, use the Zwift platform, use something like Trainer Road, whatever you have available to open up your graph when you're done with the workout, scrub over those time periods and get an evaluation of your averages and take a look at things like heart rate, how evenly you executed the power, your feedback from within the workout itself, and learn some things and help to create your zones and create training plans for yourself. That's awesome. I fully encourage that. But if you're just looking for something like a bonus or something a little bit harder to challenge yourself with, there's better ways to attack that. So if you have any additional questions that I might not have covered in this video, please leave them down below. I'll be happy to help you guys out more down there. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the thumbs up button if you got any value out of this video. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.